There was a big question in these pre-conclave meetings about would the legacy of Francis be continued or would there be a rollback?
1 year after the election of Pope Leo XIV, a new book by two veteran Vatican journalists reveals the inside story of the conclave that elected the first American pope.
Nobody was quite sure who would get elected. I spoke to many cardinals. Many cardinals were saying we can never have an American.
In the book, The Election of Pope Leo XIV, The Last Surprise of Pope Francis, Gerard O'Connell and his wife, Elisabetta Piquet, unpack step by step how the College of Cardinals came to see Cardinal Robert Prevost as the right choice for a changing global church.
Some of them went back and looked at Prevost, and they saw that he's lived on 3 continents. He speaks many languages, and then there was another factor.
In this conversation with Catholic News Service, we talked to Jerry about his deep reporting on the politics of the conclave, what Pope Leo has done thus far, and how an American pope is touching the religious imagination of millions around the world.
I think people are looking for someone who will lead them to God, who will help them to lead better lives, who will help them to overcome the sufferings, the difficulties, the polarization, but also who will address the questions of injustice in the world.
If you had one big picture, concrete prediction for the future of Pope Leo's papacy, what would it be? This is Vatican Access. Before this episode begins, just a quick note. If you want to understand the Vatican, not just how and why the big decisions are made, but what leaders in the church actually think about the most important questions, faith, God, meaning, the challenges facing our world today, then the benefit of this program is cumulative. It builds over time through the mosaic of voices that we are going to feature on this podcast. So if those kinds of conversations matter to you as they matter to me, go ahead and subscribe to our channel and share our work. It will ensure that you get notified as soon as new episodes are released, and it will help the algorithm push our content so that we can reach more people who might have questions just like you. Catholic News Service is glad to make this content available to you free of charge. It's our service to you, offering you real Vatican access in an age when it can be increasingly difficult to hear what actually matters. Thank you. Now back to the episode. Gerard O'Connell, thank you so much for sitting down with Catholic News Service.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So I would like for you to take me back to the early days of May 2025. Pope Francis had famously internationalized in a particular and unique way the College of Cardinals. And I think most journalists at the time had no idea what dynamics would unfold. So before we get into those dynamics, would you just remind people how, from the outside, mysterious and exciting those moments were?
Well, it was extraordinary. When Francis died, the cardinals came in from 96 countries in the world. There should have been 252. Not all could come, but most of them came. But the number of electors was less. It turned out to be 133 from 70 countries. But the reality was that many of them did not know each other. About 60 of the electors knew each other very well, but a lot did not. And so they had to have name badges saying who I am and where I've come from. Because they would pass each other on the street without recognizing each other, the electors. And this was, Francis died on 21st of April, and then they began the meetings. But the meetings really started after the funeral, which was on the following Saturday. He died on the Monday, and the funeral was on the following Saturday. And after that, they really began to focus on who will be the successor.
So, I mean, people listening who may not know much about the church, I mean, there is a sense in which it's absurd that all these people who don't know each other that well are going to be asked in a very short amount of time to come up with who the vicar of Christ is on earth. I mean, what a task, but also what's the expectation of how such a thing would play out?
Well, obviously, it's not like a political convention, for sure. It's not like a party congress. But somehow there is politics at work. There is very religious, because you're choosing the leader of the largest religious organization, movement in the world. And there is also the hand of God. What Maradona, the famous, was, the hand of God. And that works in a strange way, because human factors obviously are decisive. People have to get to know each other. They have to work. The media had already identified some of the front runners.
They tend to list like 20 people, so it's like throwing 20 darts at the board. You're bound to hit one.
And the Cardinals themselves had been, they knew that Francis was in decline health-wise, and so they were already thinking among themselves. But they hadn't come to clear conclusions. And so after the funeral, the following Monday, they really began to meet in rather more serious mode, let us say, for the conclave could not start before 15 days after he died. Eventually, the conclave started on the 7th of May. And in the meetings before the conclave, several things came out. First of all, they watched those whom they considered as potential candidates, and they saw some of them being more prima donna, some of them really not even making any kind of waves, very under the radar. And Prevost was one of those. And
but nobody took him seriously in the sense that everyone, the working assumption was that an American would never be elected.
The working assumption by most cardinals was that an American would not get elected. But there was a group. I mean, we tell, my wife and I, Elizabeth and I, we tell in the book that we had heard in the March of 2024, that was 1 year before the conclave, we had heard Prevost's name being mentioned as a serious possibility to succeed Francis. That was 1 year before, but it was all under the radar, and nobody was saying publicly. So in these meetings before, when you had more than 200 cardinals gathered together, it was a series of speeches, and then they'd have coffee breaks, and then they'd meet outside also. They began to work out an identikit. What are the qualifications we'd like a pope to have, the next pope to have? Well, what are the basic elements we'd like to see in the person? And they came up with an identikit about 2 or 3 days before the conclave. And that was very important, because they went into the conclave with this kind of checklist in their mind, as it were. And then during these meetings, what happened was, and we write in the book, was one cardinal who was supporting one of the lead candidates, who was Cardinal Parolin, who was the number 2 here in the Vatican during the pontificate of Pope Francis. He'd been 12 years as Secretary of State. The man that had been the cardinal that had been identified as his kind of, they won't call it that, but campaign manager, he made an open attack on Francis in the plenary assembly of the cardinals. And this upset very much the cardinals.
What was the attack?
They attacked him because Francis had opened up the possibility for lay people to have positions of responsibility, high top responsibility positions in the Roman Curia, and consequently in the other outside the church. Not just bishops or priests or clerics, but lay people. And they felt the more conservative bloc, if you use that language, felt that this was breaking with tradition.
But you're saying Cardinal Parolin was sort of at the helm of that faction.
No, Cardinal Parolin was not at the helm of that, but when the man who was identified as his main campaign manager came out publicly attacking Francis over this and over other things, the impression that was given was that he's talking about a rollback of the progress that Francis had made, also in the question of a synodal church. That's a church where different people have co-responsibility for running the church. And the cardinals who were very strongly pro-Francis, they reacted strongly. But also those who were in the middle ground, who weren't sure who they were going, they did not like what they had heard.
Is it known who this campaign manager was?
Yes, it was Cardinal Benjamin Stella. He had been a trusted cardinal in the pontificate of Pope Francis. Francis knew him before he became pope. When he became pope, he made him head of one of the Vatican offices, the one for clergy, and he made him a cardinal. And he listened and he took very seriously the advice from this man. And so for the cardinals who knew this, to see him going exactly the opposite direction and attacking Francis, it was a shock. And I got the story on the same day from a cardinal who was very angry. And then several other cardinals made clear that they were angry and they didn't like what they were saying. This was all meant to be secret.
Right. But I want to talk about the secrecy. But do you know if what angered these cardinals was the in principle the idea that was being forwarded, namely that lay people maybe should not run some of these offices, or was it more of a question of delicacy of offending the legacy of Francis?
There were, I would say, three things. First of all, they knew this man was trusted by Francis, and here he was attacking Francis. And that, first of all, was a shock. Secondly, this was a big change that Francis made when he reformed the Roman Curia, which is the Vatican civil service, opening up the possibility for lay people to be to have top positions of responsibility. And thirdly, it was seen as an appeal to the more conservative bloc.
Maybe they believed they needed that vote,
yes.
And it was just political.
Yeah. And so people said, but he is representing Parolin. He's attacking Francis. He's attacking one of the big changes of Francis. And they criticized him for other things, Francis for other things too. And so they began to feel this kind of platform, if you wish, is going to roll back the achievements that were reached under Francis. And remember, of the 80% of the electors were chosen by Francis.
Mm-hmm.
So this played very badly, and it didn't work. And then there was a whole other group who attacked Francis, who attacked the opening to China. Francis had brokered, through Cardinal Parolin, an agreement with China for the nomination of bishops, giving the Pope the final word. The Chinese could organize the election of the candidate, but then the Pope had the final word on who would be the bishop. Many people attacked this accord, and in doing so, they were attacking Parolin as well, because he was seen as the chief architect. So,
but in fact, it had the early drafts of that agreement began under Benedict. Is that?
It began under Benedict. In fact, I followed it very carefully, and it was substantially what had been reached under Benedict, but Benedict had rejected it.
Mm-hmm.
And Francis had this breakthrough with the help of Parolin on this, but it found a lot of opposition in the United States among many cardinals, but also the American government, the administration, Eastern Europe, and also some of the Asian countries. They were not very happy with it.
And for people who are not insiders, what was the objection? If you were going to make the best possible case against the agreement, what would that look like?
What people were seeing by the time Francis died, Xi Jinping, the president of China, was elected president more or less the same time as Francis was elected pope. But in those 12 years, he'd cracked down on religion very heavily. And so they said, the Catholic Church has made an agreement with China at a time when really what is happening inside, for example, a Catholic family could not take their children to church. They could not have them have Catholic education. If they did, they was penalized by the authorities. And so they said, we have forgotten a little the underground church, that was the church which has resisted being co-opted into the government system, and we've opened up the agreement with the those who are approved by the government. And so there was a strong feeling about this. And so in those meetings, the pre-conclave meetings of the assemblies of the cardinals, these issues came up. And the one who was getting targeted, one was Francis, but also Parolin. He suffered from those meetings.
From different directions,
From different directions, yes. Then in 2013, Cardinal Bergoglio, the future Pope Francis, in the second or third last day of the conclave, the second last working day, he gave a 3.5-minute speech that electrified the assembly, and they saw, he's saying something different to what the others possible candidates are saying. He's offering a new vision. In this pre-conclave meetings of the 225 election, 2025, the Cardinal Prevost he spoke, but there was no impact.
He didn't make a big splash.
Where he did make a big impact was during the coffee breaks. They saw him as a person who listened a lot. They saw him as a person who was very humble. And they liked what they saw.
One of the criticisms of Pope Francis had been that he governed in a, for lack of a better term, autocratic mode, that he made a lot of the decisions himself. The listening quality of Cardinal Prevost, that was a reassurance to cardinals from all over the world that if he were the Pope, they would have a voice again.
Well, that was how some of them read it. Francis did listen, but Francis was a prophetic figure. I think history will show that he was breaking new ground. He was opening new ways of looking at the church, of being church. And some of them didn't like it because they had been accustomed to one way of being church, and Francis was saying, no, we're going another way. We're going to be a missionary church. We're going to go out. We're not going to wait for people in the sacristy to come in. We're going to have lay people, ordinary people, the poor, those who don't have a voice. We're giving them a voice in how the church should be in a given geographical or cultural area. And so he was breaking new ground. Francis was, and then of course he was very committed to the poor. And so there was a big question in these pre-conclave meetings about, would the legacy of Francis be continued or would there be a rollback? And that was a very important issue. When there was obviously a candidate and he came out, in the first ballot, he came out as number one, the Hungarian Cardinal, Peter Erdő, a canon lawyer, so not a legal figure, who was a pastor, who had been bishop for many years, but who was on the more conservative bloc. They knew he was not so keen on synodality, on having everybody having a say in the church. It was clear that he would have taken things back. And he had supporters also. But again, he didn't make a big speech in the pre-conclave meetings. The speeches that made the impact were the ones, the attacks on Francis. And so when the cardinals came to go into the conclave and leave their cell phones, leave their iPads, all computers, everything behind, on the 7th of May, nobody was quite sure who would get elected. I spoke to many cardinals. Since the last 50 more years, most of the conclaves have ended in 2 days. Some cardinals were telling me it could last 3-4 days. They were unsure. Many cardinals were saying, we can never have an American. There was a big push from the Italians to regain the papacy after 47 years, because we had had John Paul II, 1978. We had then the German, Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, 2005. Then 2013, we had the first Latin American Pope. And so the Italians felt more than 200 of the 267 popes that we've had have been from Italy. So they felt almost as if they were entitled to the papacy. But this was to ignore that the axis of the Catholic Church had changed, and 70% of the Catholic population, was now in the global south. And so this was what was the situation when they went into the conclave. There was no clear frontrunner. We discovered, Elizabeth and I, we write in our book, we discovered before they went into the conclave that, yes, Prevost had more than 20 votes. Now, having studied the conclaves and having written a book on the previous conclave, on the 2030, I understood the first vote is very important. Because when there's no obvious candidate, people watch where the votes go in the first ballot.
To see who could now conceivably make it.
Yeah. And so what happened in the first ballot, you got more than 30 people got votes out of the 133 cardinals voting. More than 30.
So widespread.
Widespread. But only 3 candidates got between 20 and 30 votes. Nobody reached 30. But between 20 and 30, 3 candidates, and there was just a handful of votes between the 3. Number 1 was Cardinal Erdő, the Hungarian, the standard bearer, as it were, of the more conservative bloc.
He was number 1 or just one of the 3?
He was number 1.
Oh, okay.
He came out number 1. The second one was Prevost, Cardinal Prevost, the American. And this was a surprise to many people. And then the third cardinal was Parolin, whom the Italians, before they went into conclave, were claiming he would have 35, maybe 40 votes.
I remember that.
It didn't stand up, that prediction. And then the fourth candidate was the Frenchman, but he was under 20 votes. Aveline, the Cardinal Archbishop of Marseille, who's a figure who looked like John the 23rd. He's a kind of jovial figure, but very good with dealing with the public. So the cardinals, when they got this result, they talked a lot among themselves. And they went back to Santa Marta, which was the guest house where the Vatican house restructured under John Paul II to provide a kind of a hotel for the cardinals when they came to elect a pope. They went for dinner that evening, rather late, but many of them stayed up until about midnight, discussing, reflecting. Some of them went back and looked at the biographies, because they all had full biographies of each cardinal. And some of them went back and looked at Prevost, and they saw that he had many qualities. He was born in Chicago, had spent little over 20 years of his life in the United States, but another 20 as a missionary, first of all, a priest, and then as a bishop in Peru, and another 20 in Rome, first of all as a student of canon law, and then he became prior general, the head of the Augustinian order. So he had almost 20 years in Rome, he had almost 20 years in Latin America, and more than 20 years. He was 69 years old, and more than 20 in the United States, where he'd gone to Villanova University, studied mathematics, got a degree, and then went on to be an Augustinian. So they saw this man. He's lived on 3 continents. He speaks many languages. He spoke Spanish and English fluently. He spoke Italian fluently, French, and he spoke Portuguese. And moreover, he had Peruvian citizenship, not just because to be a bishop in Peru, you have to have Peruvian citizenship. So he had these qualities. And then there was another factor, which we tell in the book. At the first ballot, before they vote, each cardinal is given voting slips, one, they only vote once on the first day, and then they choose people who will check the ballots. So they choose 3 cardinals, one of whom, the third one, would read out the names of the cardinals who got the votes. And one cardinal said God has his own humor, because the one who read out the names on the first ballot was Cardinal Erdo. And he was reading his own name, and his voice began to fade. And they saw visibly a man who was looking rather weak. Some described him as old. They had to move the microphone in front of him so that his voice would pick up.
There had been reports previously he had been the relator at a famous synod early in Francis.
Absolutely, and he had hosted in Budapest, he had hosted International Eucharistic Congress, so that gave him a big platform. Now, in the second ballot, as I said, God has a sense of humor, one cardinal says, who should read out the votes but Prevost? And he was reading the votes, and he read them calmly, clear voice, looking very much in control. The impression was, this man can govern.
It's still quite striking that someone who did not know who they were going to vote to be the Pope on the basis of such evidence, impressive as it may be, could be persuaded in such a short amount of time.
Well, that first evening after the first ballot, people began to, his name was circulating before, and people were asking, who is this Prevost? His name was circulating. Many cardinals from Africa, from Latin America, came thinking they were going to vote for Parolin. They thought he was the choice candidate of Pope Francis. Elizabeth, my wife, wrote an article making very clear, we were very close to Pope Francis, that this was not the case.
Did he have a candidate?
Francis, we say that Prevost was the last surprise of Pope Francis. That's the subtitle of our book. Because Francis really positioned him. No pope can dictate who succeeds him. But he gave many signals in his favor. I mean, what did he do? He knew Prevost from when he was Archbishop, when Bergoglio, Francis, was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and Prevost was the prior general, the head of the Augustinians. They had met in 2005, 2006 in Buenos Aires, and they had clashed because Prevost wanted to move a Augustinian friar to another job. Bergoglio, then Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, wanted him in a different position. So they'd clashed. When Francis was elected, when Bergoglio was elected Pope Francis, Prevost was heard to say, I can relax now because I won't become a bishop, because he recalled that he had. But there was another incident which is less well known, that Francis was as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, being attacked by somebody in the Curia. And Prevost defended him.
Defended Francis.
Defended Bergoglio, the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. He defended him. So in August 2013, some months after his election as Pope, the Augustinians had to choose a new leader because Prevost had done 2 terms as head of and he couldn't do another. So they had to choose. So Prevost invited Francis to give a message or to come. Nobody expected him to come. And Francis said, no, I will come and I'll say Mass for you. So he came to the Church of St. Augustine here in Rome, and when the electors for the new head of the Augustinians were gathered, he preached, and then he said to Prevost, I never forget what you did for me. In other words, and he said, now you go and rest, because he was finishing his term of 12 years as head of the Augustinians.
But have they also had their differences? Because there was that other comment that you mentioned that...
Yes, they had that. But Francis did not like yes men. Francis liked somebody who told him straight to his face what he thought.
That's what people often said about Cardinal Pell and Francis's relationship.
Yes, it's true. He liked somebody who stood up and said to him, sorry, I don't agree with you. He did not like yes men. And Prevost was not a yes man.
Is it known what they disagreed about in that early period?
We think it's about, yes, we think it was in terms of moving, as I said earlier, moving an Augustinian friar. Bergoglio wanted him in one job in the Archdiocese of Buenos Aires. Prevost had other ideas for him, and Prevost was head of the order. So,
so people might have imagined this was a difference of one being a conservative and one being a liberal, but it was just a personnel sort of...
I don't think it was anything like that.
I'm just saying what people might imagine online out of context.
We have pictures of them, photos of them celebrating Mass together. And it was very clear when Francis accepted to go to the Church of St. Augustine here in Rome to celebrate Mass before they elected the new head of the order. Nobody expected him to do that. So it was a sign of a kind of friendliness towards Prevost. But those things weren't noticed at the time. It's with hindsight that people see this now. Then, a year later, 2014, Francis named Prevost. He knew he had been a missionary for more than 10 years in Peru. He named him as bishop of a diocese which had previously been governed by Opus Dei for 34 years. Opus Dei had many bishops in Peru, I think 7 or 8. And here he put an American missionary as head of a diocese. There was another American missionary also head of another diocese. But it was a difficult diocese, but because you also had the problem there, first of all, it was at a time when you had the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path guerrillas were still active. The MRTA, another armed guerrilla group, were still active. And then during his time in the diocese, El Nino, the climatic change, and then he got into his diocese, he got more than 1 million Venezuelans who were leaving the country because of Maduro. So he had to handle problem of dealing with migrants, the problem of climate change, the problem of armed groups, and then the question of how to deal with a diocese which had been governed for many years by Opus Dei in a different light. And he managed to do all this very quietly, very calmly, without disruption. So much so that some years later, there was a problem in another diocese, 800, 600 miles, 700 miles away from there, where the bishop was neo-catechumenal movement, and he wanted the whole diocese to be neo-catechumenal. And he was clashing with the priests, and there were a lot of disruption. Francis removed the bishop and sent Prevost as administrator of the diocese, not bishop. And in 1 year, he managed to calm the waters. And so at that point, Francis began appointing him to Rome offices, to put them on the board, as it were, of the Vatican offices. And then in 2023, he brought him to Rome to head the very important office, Vatican office for the selection of bishops. Now, he said, I want a missionary as head of this office. And he brought Prevost, and Prevost began to manage very well. Francis, some months later, made him a cardinal. And then there were 23 cardinals on the board of that Vatican office. And they would meet about every 2 weeks. And Prevost would be managing. There was also other people, some women, some bishops, but 23 cardinals, all electors. They were a key factor in Prevost getting elected because they saw how well he listened, how well he managed, how well he summarized, and the fact that he had the linguistic ability and that he could take decisions. He was a man who could govern. So, when the cardinals went into conclave and they were asking, who is this Prevost, who is this Prevost? The cardinals who knew him were able to tell others. So when they came to the second ballot next morning, the situation had changed. Prevost jumped into the first position. Erdo, who had performed badly reading out the names, went way down. Parolin was second, or Prevost Parolin. And then they still didn't get enough. You needed 89 votes out of the 133 to get 2/3 plus 1 vote to get elected. They still hadn't, after the second ballot, a majority. So they went to the third ballot. And at that point, Prevost went way up. By the time they only voted twice in the morning. By the time they went to lunch, it was very clear that Prevost was on the path to papacy unless something extraordinary happened.
I mean, I could ask you, I think, probably at least 500 more questions about the conclave, but since we have a year of Pope Leo now under our belt, I wonder, given how close you were to Pope Francis, I could ask you a few questions about how much, with a year of hindsight now, it is the case that the conclave elected a continuity candidate.
I think it's very clear. From the moment that Prevost came out on the balcony, he was dressed like Benedict was. So
Right.
many people kind of began to develop a narrative. He is more Benedict than Francis. It wasn't true.
I mean, do you think what was the reason he wore that when he knew, he must have known how symbolic it was going to be?
Yes, he obviously. I think I think he likes to follow protocol. I think he's a canon lawyer, so he likes to follow the law. He's a mathematician, so he's very precise. In fact, he came out with a text, a written text. Francis came out without anything and just spoke from the heart.
But I mean, hadn't Francis given future popes the permission to do that? So in a sense, the protocol, even if it were still in the books, Prevost would have been free to...
I think Prevost felt that, as Pope, he had to be very careful. This is how I see. And so he liked to... He had scripted what he wanted to say. The first thing he said was peace. Francis had been very strong on peace. He said, peace to you all. So, and he has been consistent in this year. We're at the end of 1 year's papacy. He has continued down that path of peace, peace, peace. End conflict, start negotiations. He has not hidden one way his commitment to peace. Then he said, we have to work together. His mottos is peace and unity. So he wanted them all. Francis had said when he started his papacy, I'm the bishop, we're the people, we work together. Leo said something similar, but he made very clear that he wanted to work together with the Roman Curia, with the bishops, etc. And then he's surprising. He spoke about the commitment to the poor, which is a strong theme of Francis, and then about synodality. I mean, most people, the global audience, well, what is this word synodality? He said, I want a synodal missionary church. So he was signaling very clearly that I am following what Francis started. Francis always said, I begin processes. I start things. It's up to others to build. In other words, he's kind of architect. He lays the foundation of the house, and then someone else has to build the house. And that's how Francis saw his... So he spoke about a missionary synodal church. Leo, missionary pope, calling for a synodal church. And then he said, we've got to proclaim Christ to the world. That's what we're about.
Is there anything he's done so far in those areas, whether it be in the synodal church governance, that sort of puts his own emphasis or his own spin on Francis's ideas, such that if we could imagine if Francis were to appear, and that Francis would have some concern about the emphases that the new pope is making?
On peace, no. He expresses himself. They're different personalities. Francis was more Latin, outgoing. He is more... introvert is too strong a word, but more reserved. He likes to be very precise when he talks. Francis spoke off the cuff, freely. He would have a text and he would ditch the text.
Mm-hmm.
Leo sticks very carefully. We've seen now all these speeches. He's rarely, you could count not even on 3 fingers, the number of times he's departed from the text.
This is something that's mysterious to me, is because he clearly has made a decision to read his texts and to be careful, yet he will still do the Tuesday night greetings with the journalists and speak off the cuff about very important matters. So how do you see those as not being in tension with one another?
Well, I think he said at the beginning he was learning to be Pope. I think Francis, in a way, was in some ways a freer spirit. Francis had big struggles within his order, within the Jesuits. Leo, there's no evidence of big struggles within the Jesuits. He governed and he challenged, but it was harmony. And as I said, his motto, his kind of the two priorities are peace and unity. But when he met the Cardinals, soon after being elected, and he met them, he made very clear that he was very much on Francis' track, and he spoke about the programmatic document of Francis, the joy of the gospel, Evangelii Gaudium. He says, and he picked out various elements of that he's going to follow on. And then when he met the group in June 2025, he met the Council of the Synod. These are the people that were elected to continue the Synod process. And they immediately started asking him questions, lots and lots of questions. He came in with his notepad in his hand. And he told them, look, I'm not the Lone Ranger. This is Synod. We're meant to be synodal. And so Francis was pushing the Synod. Leo is now building the Synod, but more from within in a way. And then I think his relationship to the Roman Curia was quite strongly different, because Francis, when he was elected, there was a tradition that you gave €500, $500 more or less, to every employee for the extra work they did during the transition period from
conclave
one pope.
Bonus.
Yeah, a bonus. Francis said, no, this goes to the poor. Leo said, no, this goes to you. And that ingratiated himself very much. And then he said to them, the popes come and go, but the Curia remains. And that made them. And second, certainly the Secretariat of State, which is the Secretariat of the Pope, really, part of the Roman Curia, but the closer, they feel that they have been more enhanced under Leo than they were on Francis.
I'm not sure if it was in your book, but I saw it reported that maybe the prefect of one of the Roman offices said they were having a conversation, and there was a concern that Prevost was not curial, and the other one said, don't worry, we'll make him one of us.
On the night of the election, when the white smoke had gone up, they didn't know who was elected. So from the Secretariat of State, many, many of them came out on the balcony looking over St. Peter's Square from the Secretariat of State. And then they were convinced it was Parolin. The election was so quick. Because there had been this narrative that Francis had left a church that was divided. In actual fact, it's not true, because they were able to elect a pope in less than 24 hours. They had found unity very quickly. But in this group from the Secretariat of State who were in the balcony, when Prevost came out, they had been expecting Parolin. They said, anyway, we will make him one of us.
What does that mean for people who may not know the Vatican?
It means that we'll work in a way that he becomes like us.
Can you say more?
Well, that's what they said. I think what it means is that they felt that they will be able to bring him to their way of thinking and return more to the former way before Francis.
So maybe there was not a divide in the College of Cardinals. In other words, for it to be true that that Francis had not left the church divided, and the evidence of that being the speed of the conclave.
Sure.
All that would need to really be true is that the College of Cardinals was more or less united. But what you're saying about the Curia suggests a dynamic of
the Curia, and I think also the Vatican Media Office. They were all convinced that with an election in 4, they were expecting Parolin because he was in the Italian media being touted as the front runner who went into conclave with around 35, 40 votes. That was what was said. In fact, it wasn't true, but they didn't know it at that time. And they felt convinced. And when it was such a quick election, they hadn't seen anybody else. They thought maybe Tagle, the Filipino, could be a candidate, but he didn't perform so well in the voting. So they felt that so quick, it must be Parolin. And then they were a little stunned when it was Prevost. And in fact, even the crowd in the square, they weren't quite sure who this Prevost was.
Do you think the fact that he was an American was also something that gave people in the Curia pause and trepidation?
They knew him. He'd been part of the Roman Curia for 2 years. So it was a candidate from the Roman Curia who'd got elected. But he had not been in any of the power blocks within the Curia.
He kept a low profile.
He had kept a low profile. He was under the radar, both publicly and privately. He'd very friendly, but he hadn't publicly clashed with anybody. There was, in fact, he was there almost. He wasn't a prima donna in the Roman Curia. And so they were a little taken aback, and then they were asking, but they felt he was so low profile that it would be possible to, I don't know, Robert, if you've seen the British film Yes, Minster.
I have not, no.
It's wonderful. It was years back now, and I mean decades back, I think, where they told the story about you have the British civil service, and then you have an election, and you get new ministers and a new prime minister. And all the civil servants, when the new minister would come, or the prime minister, they would say, yes, minister, and then they would gradually organize that things went the way that they always went. And so there was this kind of feeling in the Roman Curia as well, that we can mold, we can shape, we can form the Pope.
A year out, do you think that Pope Leo has kept his independence?
He's regaining his independence because the first 6 months of his pontificate, well, longer, from May until January 6, the program had already been determined because it was the Jubilee year and it had already been planned. So what he was doing was mainly the program that Francis would have done, with a few exceptions. But since 7 of January 2026 of this year, he's kind of steering his own path. And he is shows that the appointments he's made, people hadn't anticipated.
How would you characterize his general selection of candidate?
He's very much his own. He's got his own mind.
Which is what?
Well, he listens, and then he decides. They don't know who's coming. I mean, he appointed his successor, and nobody had anticipated that the man Iannone, Archbishop Iannone, an Italian, would be his successor. Nobody had imagined. They had a lot of names. He appointed the head of the legislative text. He brought in somebody from Australia. They hadn't anticipated this. He's appointed the head of the papal household. They hadn't anticipated this either.
How does he know? Who's he listening to make these appointments?
That is a good question, and nobody is quite sure who he is listening to. He's obviously listening, that is for sure. And he's meeting a lot of people, and he's met people from different areas of the church, let's say. But nobody's quite sure who is his closest advisors. But his choices so far have been very independent. Look at the Archbishop of New York. He chose someone whom he knew. So it is very interesting that he's got his own mind. And I think the way he responded to President Trump's attack was a very clear instance. Because he spoke to about 5 or 6 different journalists on the plane. I was on the plane. And he said something, adding different things to each one. But he had a very clear idea of what he wanted to say. He said, I'm not afraid of the administration, the American administration.
The New York Times portrayed later comments he made to journalists as having walked back that initial statement of strength.
Well, that's an interpretation. I'm not quite sure this. What he said was, when he used the expression that there are tyrants, a group of tyrants governing the world, this was taken immediately as referring to President Trump.
That's what it was.
What he was saying, that these speeches were written before Trump spoke. But I say that if we want to really read what Leo is saying, we have to go back to the 9th of January speech to the Diplomatic Corps, in which a lot of work had gone into preparing that speech to express what he actually wanted to say. So that is the frame, I think, within which other statements should be read. So I don't quite agree with the interpretation of New York Times. I understand that he seemed to be saying, blame the messenger. Getting it wrong, interpreting. He said some interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I do think that the frame to understand his general position on state, power, what's happening in the world, poverty, and all this injustice has to be seen in the frame of the 9th January speech, which he gave to the 184 ambassadors from the countries that have diplomatic relations with the Holy See.
Given what you had said earlier about how Prevost was being spoken about even as early as March of 24, as a journalist, someone who was close to Francis, did you take the opportunity then to try to get to know Cardinal Prevost?
I got to know Prevost before that, I think. I had spoken a few times privately to him, 1-hour conversations. So I had got to know him, yes.
What's something you could tell?
Like Pope Francis.
What's something you could tell us based on those, without obviously revealing anything private, that maybe that many people don't know about who he is or how he thinks?
I think the things that are out there public are very clear. He's very straightforward. He listens very carefully. Sometimes you have to ask him a question to see what the answer is. He listens. Is very clearly a man of government. He's not going to be rushed. that struck me. I think he's quite sensitive to how the media report him. I found that he's really quite a humble person. He's not somebody who kind of looks down at you. He talks very straight, like one-to-one on a par. And that's not always the case here in the Vatican. Sometimes you go in and they know and you don't. And he's very. I found him very, very open, very friendly, very willing to listen. He doesn't go into confrontation.
Do you think there's been evolution in him over the course of Francis's papacy? We had a couple opportunities, we at Catholic News Service, to interview him. Once in 2012 on the sidelines of the Synod on the New Evangelization, in which he gave a speech about various cultural dimensions that sort of attack the church culturally. He, I think, referred to gender ideology, same-sex marriage, and their positive portrayals in Hollywood, right? And then when he was made a cardinal in 2023, we asked him if he had changed since that original speech, and he referred to Francis's emphasis on welcome and mercy. I wonder whether you think it was right to, as some people do, interpret those comments in 2012 as being, let's say, more conservative, and whether he has changed during Francis's papacy.
I think it's very clear he's open to learning more. His ideas develop. He's not a closed mind. That came. You asked me what came across to me. He's not a closed mind. So he is not rigid in his thinking. He develops, and this is very clear. And I think we see he himself says, for example, on the diplomatic front, he's learning. I've seen also how he changes in terms of delivery. On the trip to Africa, we see how powerfully he can speak. He comes out very strong. I think in time we will see him gaining more, perhaps giving the Spirit a little more chance to go off cuff, speak off cuff, like he does when he's sometimes at Castel Gandolfo. Look, you go back to the Second Vatican Council, when you read the history of it, you see that many of the more than 2,000 bishops from around the world who came, they came with ideas, fixed ideas. And then they found that it wasn't the same in Africa as in Asia, as in Europe, as North America. And it was like going back to school for many of them. I think the synods, which Prevost has participated in, especially the ones on synodality, have also been a school for him, but also for the other cardinals, and they have learned, and they have begun to see that maybe nobody has a monopoly on the truth, and that there are other ways of looking at the question. And one thing is very clear: he's not going to kind of push to polarize the situation. He's looking for ways to bring the sides together.
I mean, on the plane back from Africa, he was asked about same-sex blessings, and he said that he was not going to go beyond what Francis had established in the document he wrote on that subject. So I suppose people listening to this, you may want to respond to that directly before I ask the larger question.
I think that the central point he made was when he began the answer by saying sexuality is not the central part of Catholic morality. There are bigger issues, the questions of justice, the question of the poor. He listed a whole lot of things and said sexuality cannot be the central part of our morality. And this was a very important point, and is exactly what Francis said in his programmatic document, the Joy of the Gospel, his opening. So they're on this. He's able to navigate. He will not. He's not going to go out and provoke polarization. He's trying to dismantle polarization.
The reason for that polarization, do you think Francis bears any responsibility for that?
Look, the polarization was there before Francis. They accused Francis of creating confusion and creating polarization. I remember in an interview which we have in the book with Cardinal Muller, who raised this question about Francis creating confusion. I said, well, would you say the same about John Paul II in 1986 when he had the meeting of the different religions in Assisi, and they accused him of creating confusion and syncretism? And he admitted it. And I said, and Paul VI with the Humanae Vitae? I said, the reality is that polarization comes to the church also from the political world. People live in the political world, and they tend to see questions in black and white. And so there are no shades of other shades between this. Francis was very clear about this, that, that things are not so black and white. And I think Leo is much the same. He says he will not go beyond what Francis said, but he's not going to roll back what Francis said. People there's a narrative that was looking that he was going to roll back what Francis said. He's a different style. He's a different personality. The Cardinals did not want a clone of Francis, and they did not get a clone of Francis.
We've been talking a lot of what could be characterized as inside baseball, the dynamics of the conclave, details and clues about what appointments he's made, Pope Leo's made, that may give us some indication about where he's going to take the church. I think that most ordinary Catholics, when they're thinking about the election of a pope and what a pope is going to mean for their own lives, may have one or two particular issues that they care deeply about. That could be some issue related to sexuality or to the liturgy, and they're wondering whether or not the Pope is going to deliver on that particular issue. How would you maybe recharacterize what should be the way Catholics in general look at the ministry of the Pope, and what can Pope Leo do to really bring everybody together?
I think basically people look to him as a spiritual leader, as one who will lead them to God, who will offer a word of consolation in a world which is divided, who will work towards overcoming the conflicts, overcoming the divisions. Francis was very clear, and Leo is very clear, that we're all children of God, brothers and sisters, fratelli tutti, and that the church is open to all, todos, 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 everyone, everyone, everyone. Leo has said exactly the same. I think people are looking for someone who will lead them to God, who will help them to lead better lives, who will help them to overcome the sufferings, the difficulties, the polarization, but also who will address the questions of injustice in the world. People see a lot of injustice, they see conflict, and they see a lot of poverty, and they want somebody who is prepared to stand up and say, we're not on the right track here. And I think this is what Leo is doing, this is what Francis did. They look to him not as a politician, they look to him as a man of God. They see that he's a holy man. They saw Francis was a holy man. They look for somebody who can offer a hope of a better world than the one they're living in, many people, and who can call out, call people to responsibility. Leo was very strong when he compared how much Elon Musk is earning than the poor other person at the other side of the economic spectrum. And he said, we can't have this kind of world because inequality is growing. So they want somebody. And I was struck when Leo went to Algeria, the first pope in the history of the church to go to Algeria. And at the end of his talk to the authorities, he spoke, or one of his talks, he, on national television, read the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed. And the head of state, the president, welcomed him as a champion of justice and as a champion of peace. And I think in the election, when the Cardinals were electing him, it is very interesting that they elected a pope who was committed to social justice in a world where there's so much injustice, committed to social justice and peace in a world where there is conflict and so much injustice. I say that God is working in human history, and this is how we see it.
If you had one big picture, concrete prediction for the future of Pope Leo's papacy, what would it be?
I think he's going to emerge more and more on the peace question and on overcoming the divide between people, getting them to see as brother and sister that we're members of the one human family, and the poverty. I think he's going to be very strong about attempting to address that this economy kills, in the words of Pope Francis, which he has used, and saying, can we not do a better job with our world? I think in the church, I think he will bring a lot of unity.
With President Trump?
Look, President Trump has 3 more years. Leo could well have 20. He will outlive this, apart from some attempt, he will outlive the President Trump. And Trump is not the only leader in the world. I mean, we see what's happening in the Holy Land with Netanyahu. We see what's happening in Ukraine with Putin. And I think, the church has seen empires come and go. And they will see this happen too. Presidents come and go.
Gerard O'Connell, thank you so much for sitting down with Catholic News Service.
Thank you.